Please do take your seats. And we're going to think, as Nick mentioned, about Psalm 124 for a few moments now. There's a little sheet of paper which has Psalm 124 on it if you'd like to follow along. Now, one of the most extraordinary things about this psalm is that it celebrates God's protection with a whole host of really powerful images. It's talking about, well, it's counterfactuals. If God hadn't been on our side, when the whole host of humanity were ranged against us, when the flood was overwhelming us, when like a bird we were being trapped, caught in a snare, if God hadn't been on our side in all those situations, it would have been it for us. But he was. And for the psalmist, knowing that God was on his side, it results in praise. You see that there, praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. And it results in confidence. Our help is in the present tense, right now, in the name of the Lord, in the last verse, the maker of heaven and earth. He's clearly expecting there might be some more situations coming up where he needs God's help. But he knows, not only can I praise God because he's already delivered me from these things in the past, but right now in the present, and whatever comes in the future, God will be with me, helping me. Now, if that were true, that you could know God like that, on your side, whatever you face in life, your help right there with you, well, all of us would want that to be the case, wouldn't we? If it were true that God could be a help in these kind of situations, these situations where overwhelmingly it looks like you've got no hope, you'd want God like that. But can it be true? Can we say the same thing as the psalmist in our own lives today? Well, to see if we can, I think it's helpful, first of all, to just think a little bit about why the psalmist could say this and what he means by saying, our help is in the name of the Lord. What he means by saying, the Lord was on my side. We might think that he's talking in slightly, I suppose, mythic language. When we hear the psalmist in all kinds of places talking about God protecting him, keeping him safe, being his help, we might be thinking, well, something like the way that ancient heroes called on, say, the ancient gods. If you know the stories of the Greek heroes, where the gods would turn up, and not always for sort of noble ends, but nevertheless they'd come alongside their heroes and help them. Sometimes in extraordinary ways in their lives. Think about Achilles, the great hero who was dipped into that potion that meant that he was safe apart from his heel. He was protected through his life. These moments where the gods would step in and do something extraordinary, perhaps, to make their chosen people, their chosen heroes, whoever they are, safe, at least in the short term. It's tempting to think that that's what the psalmist is talking about in his own life. He's known God do something just unbelievable that kept him safe in these different situations. But of course, if that's true, then we might well be thinking because of that, well, then for most of us, these aren't words that we can echo. Unless you're the equivalent of a Greek hero today who the gods have come and visited and given you some kind of extraordinary ability, we read this psalm and can only say something like, well, I wish that were true. But you read in the Old Testament, if you know the story of the Old Testament, there are clearly moments where God appears in extraordinary, powerful ways. But so often in the Old Testament, as you read the stories, what God is doing is working in the midst of the ordinary, or at least in the midst of you could explain what's going on in terms of ordinary human terms. Maybe the biggest example of that is the story of the exile, where Old Testament Israel, having for years existed as a stable nation under kings like David, is carted off as captives of the Babylonian Empire. Now, you look at that story sort of without reference to God, and it's a story of great powers. It's a story of powerful kings doing what they like. It's a story of one great empire after another, and eventually one of them comes and says, Israel, I'll wipe that out. I'll have that country for myself. And your experience, if you live in Israel, would be the big bad neighbor over to the north and the east coming to take us away. You could tell that story without reference, if you like, to God. And yet God says throughout the Old Testament, exile is my plan, my purpose. I'm doing it. So he's working through the ordinary means of a great powerful king and his mighty empire, but it's him doing the thing, him carrying off his people into exile because of their disobedience. Now, it's very likely that this psalm was said, was sung, was spoken, was recited by people in Israel who lived after the exile had happened and after they had been brought back into the land that they had been kicked out of. So it seems like for ancient Israelites, as they read this psalm, they would have been thinking about things like the exile, thinking about the flood that overwhelmed them. Well, that was the exile. When people were ranged against them to attack them, that was the exile. Ordinary things, if you like. This psalmist can see God at work in the midst of those. Even as great powers are doing their thing, working their works, achieving their great military feats, God's working. In other words, you don't need to have met a Greek god or the God of the Bible in a visible and powerful and amazing way to be able to say similar things to this psalmist. What this psalmist is doing is seeing in the midst of the ordinary stuff of life, all its ups and downs, God's hand at work. You might think of it like this. Can you think about any sort of bad choice you've made in your past? Think about 10, 15 years ago. If I sort of play my clock back 10 or 15 years, I was a younger man and I made all kinds of bad choices. Or put it more pointedly, I prayed stupid prayers. I prayed prayers that I look back now, I think, man, am I glad God didn't answer that prayer with a yes. Where would I be today if God had answered the 10 years previous me with a yes to some of the prayers that I prayed? But he didn't answer those prayers with a yes. He directed my course in different ways. Here's the thing, though. What will 10 years in the future me think of some of the choices and prayers I'm praying today? You know, I can kid myself and thinking I've learned all the lessons that 10-year-old previous me failed to learn, and now I'm making all the right choices and praying all the right prayers. If I'm honest for just a second, though, 10 years in the future me will look back and think, wow, you are still making bad choices and still praying stupid prayers. And God wasn't answering them in the way that you thought he should. He was directing your path in better ways than you can even begin to see now. In the midst of all of the ordinary and the mundane, I think this psalmist is saying, there is a God directing your course far beyond your ability to see it, far beyond your capacity to make good choices, and it's sort of all coming down to you. I think that's the perspective that this psalmist has. That as he reflects on his own sort of place in the world, there are things beyond him, things outside of him, which are far bigger than his capability to deal with. If he was just honest for a second, he hasn't got the resources in him to forge his path in the world in the best way. But he is confident that there is a God directing his ends. Whether things are ranged against him or there are bad choices that he's making, bad prayers that he's praying, there is a God who's working sort of underneath it all for good. If you heard in our collect this morning, you might have heard words that are sort of famous words in the history of the church. They're from a great saint called Augustine. In one of his most famous works, which the collect for this morning picked up, he talks about our hearts being restless till they find their rest in God. If we take an honest look within our lives, we have hearts that are confused, pointing in all the wrong directions, fixing on created things rather than looking up to the Creator. And that means that we make all kinds of bad choices. We get in all kinds of situations that ought to kind of bring us down. In another place, Augustine prays this: without you, talking to God, what am I to myself but a guide to my own destruction? I mean, that's some pretty deep self-knowledge there. If it weren't for God, I'd lead my own way to my own destruction. But the point is, we're not destroyed. The psalmist is saying, I'm not eaten up. The flood didn't come up to my head and beyond. I escaped from the snare. By which he's saying, I think, not, well, if God hadn't appeared in this triumphant vision, in extraordinary triumph, if he hadn't done that, then I'd have been lost. But more something like this: if God had not been working in ways that I couldn't see in my life, in ways that I've just sort of almost was blinkered to, if God hadn't been doing that, then I would have been lost. But I see now I'm not. And notice he's also saying, well, he's not saying here, well, I'm grateful I've had no pain or trouble. Because God was on my side, I sort of went through life and avoided all the bad things. No, he experienced a flood. I think is probably a metaphor. But he experienced water coming up to his head. That can't have been much fun for him. He experienced people ranged against him, attacking him. He experienced trouble. But it didn't overwhelm him. As he looks back now, he sees God protected him right in the middle of the trouble, not by sort of keeping him so he never experienced it at all, but by preserving him through it. So this psalm is an invitation, I think, to all of us, each one of us, to look back on our lives, on our past, on our journey up to this point. And if we want to have confidence like the psalmist does, that our future will be okay, then look back like the psalmist does and see God's hand at work in your life. And if you want resilience in whatever adversity you face, like the psalmist has, if you want it so that the painful things that we all experience won't overwhelm us like a flood, then look back like the psalmist and trace God's hand in your life. See the ways that God was working for you. But we might be thinking at this point, can we really do that? Can we really look back on our lives and actually see this kind of powerful imagery being true for us? You know, we might look back and say, well, I perhaps made a bad choice there, wasn't as kind as I could have been to that person. I should have thought more about that situation than I did. Can we really look back, though, and say, oh, there was a flood overwhelming me? Or I was trapped in a trap, like a fowler's snare, and it released and I escaped. I had people surrounding me on all sides and God brought me through it. Can we really say that sort of powerful thing? Well, this is where we have an enormous advantage over the psalmist. Because in the light of Jesus Christ and his life and death and resurrection, we really can say that sort of thing. It's striking in this psalm that the details that the psalmist talks about they map incredibly well onto the death of Jesus Christ himself. It's in the sort of language the psalmist used. When he says, if the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, and literally it means when humanity, the whole of humanity was ranged against us. And I don't know what in the psalmist's life made him talk like that about his own life. But it is extraordinary how that is what happened to Jesus Christ at the end of his life. When if you read the Gospels, you find all of the good, the great, the noble, and all the crowds massed against Jesus, wanting to get rid of him. Almost no one is left to plead his case. Humanity's raged against him. Their anger flares against Jesus. You see the crowds crying out to have him crucified. And when the psalmist talks about the raging waters flooding, sweeping over us, literally sweeping over my soul, overwhelming my soul. If you know the story of Jesus Christ, when he's in the garden, he talks about his soul being overwhelmed to the point of death. And as he dies, well, the Gospels talk about him giving up his spirit, his soul, in death for us. This psalm is, as well as a psalmist looking back on his life, it's also a psalm pointing forward to the events of Jesus' last hours, his death. But here's what's so striking about Jesus' death. The psalmist says, I was so close to being overwhelmed. The floods came up to my neck. The peoples were raging against me and God got me out. You know the story of Jesus. The water came up to his neck and over. The people were raged against him and won. The trap clasped on his leg and it didn't let go. Jesus Christ wasn't plucked out at the last moment. He was buried underneath the flood that overwhelmed him. It took his very life away. And yet that was precisely the way that God, if you like, proved to us that he will always and forever be on our side if we belong to Jesus Christ. If that is what God would go through, if that is what God would do to save and deliver us from our greatest enemies of sin and death, then much, much more than the psalmist, we can say, the Lord is on my side. There'll be times when it might feel like I can't see how it's the case, but my perspective is very limited. We've already said that. But whatever I experience now, my greatest ups and my greatest downs, there is a God who knows me and loves me and has proved that love by in his own Son being overwhelmed to the point of death. That's exactly the logic that the Apostle Paul brings to bear in Romans chapter 8. Just listen to what Paul says. If God is for us, in other words, if God is on our side, if God is for us, who can be against us? On its own, that sounds attractive. Yeah, if that's true, of course. If God's for you, then who can be against you? But how do you know God is for you? Well, he who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Paul's logic is, if God is for us, so for us that he gave up his Son for us, then whether your today right now is bright sunny uplands or the dark, dark valley, or whether that will be the case for your tomorrow that you enter the valley, or the day after that, if Jesus Christ gave up his life for you, then you really can say with the psalmist, the Lord has been on my side, he is eternally on my side, and right now, today, he is my help in the midst of whatever I am facing. Well, let's be quiet and reflect on these verses for ourselves. and then Nick will come and lead us in responding in the words of the Creed.